Welcome. I'm really, really delighted to have you here. This panel is an exemplary panel, and we are going to explore the interdimensions of climate change. The title of our program is A Future We Can Love, From Inner Transformation to Outer Action. And my name is Susan Bauer Wu. I'm the president of the Mind and Life Institute. I'm also the author of the book, A Future We Can Love, How We Can Reverse the Climate Crisis Through the Power of Our Hearts and Minds. And the book was recently released in June of 2023, and it's actually the inspiration for this panel together. And the panel was inspired by a conversation. Actually, the book was inspired by a conversation by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and climate activist Greta Thunberg and climate scientists that took place in January of 2021. And the book really explores how we can work with our mindsets and cultivate psychological resilience and learn from contemplative wisdom and how we can wake up and show up to rise to the occasion of the climate crisis. So I'm really delighted to be joined by incredible panelists. We're all over the world right now, and I'll go through each person. I'll begin with Jamie Bristow. And Jamie is an expert on contemplative practice and public life, and also has been very active in climate change campaigning. And from 2015 to 2023, he was the director of the Mindfulness Initiative and also the clerk to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Mindfulness in the UK. And he's currently the lead on policy and advocacy for the Inner Development Goals. And Jamie is based in Sheffield, England. And next is Alyssa Eppel. And Alyssa is a contemplative health psychologist and a scientist. She's professor and vice chair of psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco. And she's author of The Stress Prescription and the Telomere Effect. And she's joining us from San Francisco, California. And our third panelist is Thupten Jinpa. And Jinpa is a Buddhist scholar. He's founder of the Compassion Institute. He's board chair of the Mind and Life Institute. He's the principal English interpreter for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And he is author of The Fearless Heart. And Jinpa is based in Montreal, Canada. Welcome. So I'm really excited for us to dig into this topic together. I think that it adds a new light into what we're all facing. And I'd love for Jinpa for you to begin. So you were actually instrumental in our early conversations in writing the book in terms of how we structured it. And so the book is structured into 4 sections: knowledge, capacity, will, and action. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about why the flow makes sense and how that connects with Buddhist theory of ethics and karma. So we'd love to just hear your thoughts as an introduction.
So thank you, Susan. It's a real joy and privilege to be, on this panel sharing the platform with you and Jamie and Elissa. The sort of my suggestion for this kind of structure for the book really comes from the struggle I've been feeling about climate issue in relation to general public. Because of course there's a lot of expert knowledge out there, particularly coming from science and intergovernmental climate reports and so on. But when it comes to the general public, people often get totally overwhelmed and lost. They don't know where to start. And the most, widespread awareness and knowledge that people do have is more on the negative side of the danger that is looming behind. And I'm to the point where, for example, I'm a father of 2 girls who are now in their early 20s, and they don't want to have children. They don't see themselves as being parents because they're just so terrified of what the world is going to look like. So what I was hoping in this book, and I think the book has really succeeded in doing, is to provide a framework that is manageable to general public to really have a much more comprehensive understanding of this whole climate issue, not just from the perspective of the doom and gloom, but also from our responsibility and participation that we as human beings and our behaviors played, and also how there are cycles, that scientists now refer to them as feedback loops, which are chain reactions, which goes in the negative direction of a vicious cycle, but that very same mechanism can be tapped into turning into a virtuous cycle. So what I had was thinking about is that, for example, if you look at most ethical theories, including particularly Buddhism, ethics really is about human responsibility towards fellow human beings and the world. And that responsibility also involves culpability, taking responsibility to our action. And now, if you dig deeper, many of these ethical systems have a kind of a basic structure which really goes from knowledge to capacity to will to action. So if you don't have the knowledge, then you're not responsible, you're not culpable because you did not know. So knowledge really is an important, premise for any ethical action that we take or ethical responsibility that we may have. So knowledge is an important part. Then second is, even if you know, but if you don't have the ability to do anything, then again you are less culpable. So the knowledge, it has to be accompanied by some ability on your part, agency if you want. And then even if you have the knowledge and the ability, if you don't have the will, then it doesn't lead to any action. So the exercising of the will, this is where free will is such an important part of any ethical theory. Free will is an important part of that. If you don't have freedom, then you are not responsible. So if you did something under coercion, then you didn't exercise free will. So the will, exercising of the free will is very important. And then finally, the will needs to lead to action, because without action, you might have the highest ethical sensibility, but there it has no impact. You may feel good about yourselves, but if it does not get expressed in actual behavior of some kind, even this, like even saying something, making a case, is an action. So action need not necessarily be seen purely in just bodily terms. It could be speech as well. So that seems to capture a kind of a structure which I thought could be actually brought to the whole, climate issue. Particularly, I'm thinking here more from the point of view of ordinary people. We are all members, as members of the human family, the species that has been the most culpable and responsible for wrecking the natural planet, natural home for all the species that we share. But then how we as a human species need to take responsibility. And that responsibility has to be based upon understanding what we have done and what we could do. More importantly, what we could do, what we have done, and what we could do, and also this idea of a capacity that we have. So I think this process from knowledge to capacity to will to action, even though it is taken out of the Buddhist kind of ethical framework, but it seems to work really well in the climate issue, giving ordinary people like myself a kind of a way to handle this, and deal with this, so that we don't feel completely overwhelmed. And then when you feel overwhelmed, then you don't want to go there. That's the thing with the human psychology. Anything that is makes you feel bad, makes you feel powerless, makes you feel averse, then we develop a kind of some kind of self-protection mechanism, which we will try to be away from this. We don't want to feel it that way. So by bringing this kind of framework, and in the book that you have done, it is giving ordinary people like myself, everybody, a way to sort of come up with a manageable structure that will allow us to think deeply about, the most important existential issue of our time. I mean, if we can't get it right in the next 10, 15, or 10, 20 years, we as a species, along with all the species on this planet, are kind of done. So that it's as serious as that, but we can't let ourselves be totally overwhelmed and give up. So I think the book really offers that kind of, there is, of course, the more, scary side to the book, which tells the story of what's happening, but there's also the uplifting side, which tells the story of what we can do. And I think this is why I think the structure of the book, from knowledge to capacity to will to action, is a really beautiful one. It's a powerful one.
Thank you so much, Jimpa. So speaking of knowledge and beginning with that foundation, we're actually going to begin and now show a film clip, and it's from the Climate Emergency Feedback Loops films. These are films that are available freely on the web, available in 27 languages, and it is feedbackloopsclimate.com. And we'll just show a very brief clip to provide some foundational knowledge about climate feedback loops.
Earth is warming, caused by the burning of fossil fuels like oil, coal, and natural gas, filling the atmosphere with heat-trapping gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, at levels humans have never seen before. As the world debates how much more warming the planet can take, 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, the climate crisis escalates.
The problems are that the world is becoming too hot for the present distribution of people, agriculture, human welfare, and human interest. And it's getting worse.
But it's more than our emissions heating the globe. Something else is at work here. The rising temperatures are setting in motion Earth's own natural warming mechanisms that then feed upon themselves. George Woodwell, a distinguished scientist and a lion of the environmental movement, has been sounding the alarm about them for the past 50 years. In a 1989 Scientific American article, he wrote that warming caused by human activity, rapid now, may become even more rapid as a result of the warming itself. 30 years later, climate activist Greta Thunberg repeated his warning, calling them irreversible chain reactions.
The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees and the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of equity and climate justice.
So what exactly are irreversible chain reactions? What scientists refer to as feedback loops.
A feedback that everybody is familiar with is an audio feedback, where if you put a microphone too close to a speaker, you get this terrible high-pitched screaming. And that happens because the sound comes out of the speaker and it goes back into the microphone. That's called a positive feedback because it amplifies the loop.
Instead of the guitar, emissions from fossil fuels are the input which add heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere, raising Earth's temperature and setting in motion self-perpetuating warming loops. Warming as a result of the warming itself. That ever-growing screeching noise is an apt analogy for the damage that human-caused feedback loops are wreaking on the planet. Scientists have identified dozens of feedback loops already in motion. It's imperative that we understand them if we're going to solve the climate crisis. As the climate warms, forests, once removers of carbon, release it back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, or CO2. Frozen ground in the northern hemisphere thaws and emits CO2 and methane. These are the kinds of feedback loops that lead to further warming, triggering the release of even more heat-trapping gases and raising the temperature even higher.
So, Alyssa, I'm going to turn to you next. After seeing before our eyes, visually, the climate crisis and understanding climate feedback loops, you bring a real depth of knowledge. You care a lot about the planet, and you come with a real depth of knowledge from your background in psychology and also as a scientist, a behavioral scientist. So I would just love to hear your thoughts as it relates to, helping all of us. As Shimpa says, all of us ordinary people just kind of, getting by. How can we deal with the anxiety, the grief, the despair as it relates to this issue?
Thank you, Susan. That really is the entry point, the biggest question for us at this moment. So we just saw in this film that the warming triggers further warming, these rapid feedback loops. And that means that we do have an extremely uncertain future. We have scientific models of what we thought was going to happen that we now know are shaky, that we're in for more and more surprises, tragedies, climate traumas before things can get better. So what does that do to our mind? It's very easy to feel panicky at that thought. And especially if we've been in direct contact, like so many of us have, in the midst of climate events. Here, I'm in Northern California, and we have the fires and the smoke. And what happens when we feel panic? That is the most reflexive and automatic and strong human response, which is we can have this fight-flight response, we can freeze, or we can avoid it because right now it feels distant. It doesn't feel like a crisis that's here. It's on TV, it's on a film. It was yesterday that I couldn't breathe. And so in the moment, it's so easy to avoid. So the anxiety and the avoidance are best friends. This is our natural response when we feel the discomfort and the potential darkness if we let ourselves explore and discuss our biggest fears. And so we just have to have so much compassion and humility for how our mind works. We're all doing this. This is how we get through the day. We must distract and avoid. And that's okay if we have the capacity to also hold and see reality as it is and be talking about it and be orienting our purpose and our energy around this bending the curve. So I've been in the whiplash of climate distress on and off, of the despair, seeing the bad headlines triggering catastrophic thoughts, to turning toward the beauty that's here, the love of life, the focus on so much amazing stories, so many stories that are in your book about that we are bending the curve. We are in a social tipping point. We have people all over the world who are creating the change that we need. And so it's a very dynamic, emotional time to live in, and the ability to hold the stability of holding both, of holding the what we see, what we know, that we are in this climate crisis, that there is loss, that we feel grief, and that we can feel the balance of knowing that it's not too late. The future is uncertain. That means there's possibility. So the emotions there's layers and layers to talk about, and they're complex, and we all have them, and we all struggle with them. So I want to just be really simplistic and talk about maladaptive versus adaptive climate emotion regulation. Maladaptive is our default mode. We we feel despair and we avoid, and we don't face it head on, and we don't talk about it enough. And as you said in your book, bringing open in these discussions and our true feelings, we need to be having these. That's step one. And then the adaptive climate distress is the ability to hold it all, to have this ground of resilience that the Buddhist wisdom is so focused on bringing that forth to deal with the suffering and trauma in our life. And now we have this ultimate challenge. So I've been studying the climate distress in this Bay Area sample. We've been following them. And when we measured this maladaptive climate distress, which means I can't stand to think about climate change, I'm avoiding thinking about it. When I do have these thoughts and feelings, it ruins my day. I can't go on. So that's the intolerance of what's happening. When we measure that, we find that after the 2020 fires, for example, we have a tremendous amount of climate distress across our population here. There is one individual difference that really mattered, and that was the ability to view things in a mindful way. This trait mindfulness that people have, it didn't mean they didn't care or that they didn't have distress, but they weren't doing the avoidance. And then we measured this again a year later and found that after another fire season, it's getting worse. We're avoiding more. We're feeling much more intolerant of thinking about climate, except for the people who were high in mindfulness. They stayed the same. So they're not falling into this maladaptive climate distress. And so it's just an example of these inner skills that are so well laid out in The Future We Love that we need these. These are now survival skills. We cannot survive and bring the outer change unless we have this inner change to be with the crisis that we are already in. So thank you for the arc of the book. I found that it brought together all of the pieces of both knowledge and wisdom that I've been trying to get from everywhere and everyone, and it's all there. So it was very heartening, and as Jimpa said, it was inspiring to actually see our way out, the map. The way in, as Thich Nhat Hanh has said, the way out is in.
Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you so much. So I'm going to turn to you, Jamie, and build on that. So Alyssa, essentially is pointing to how the human mind is critical in how we're coping and adapting to what we're facing. And I think we will all agree that the human mind is actually a part of the root cause of the problem and also the solution as well. So I would love for you to, share your thoughts as it relates to the role of the human mind here, particularly as the climate crisis can be considered really a problem of relationship and connection and disconnection. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and maybe expand upon this idea that I read about in the book about human feedback loops that are actually contributing to the problem. So,
thank you so much, Susan, and for including me in this wonderful panel. It is not talked about enough. As you say, intuitively we might get a sense that, of course, humans are the human mind is part of the problem and a driver in some ways, but that really hasn't been part of the, at least, policy conversation. Climate change has been treated largely as a kind of an external, technical, physical problem with technical solutions that we can kind of solve on our current level of understanding, and rather than as an adaptive problem where we need to learn new ways of being, new ways of solving things in order to address it. Your book brings together this area so well in a kind of like fleshed out and engaging way, and I think it complements very nicely the more kind of policy-oriented writing that I've been doing on this subject. And so from that, I'll start from that policy perspective, quoting from the deputy chairman of the Green Bloc in the European Parliament. He said that the IPCC conclusions, the IPCC reports haven't changed in 15 years. They say there is climate change, humans are causing it, it has great impacts, and we have the policy instruments to solve it at a reasonable cost. But why is this not happening? Why is making changes so difficult? And what we're seeing is that mainstream policy conversations, and the IPCC, the European Commission, and others are starting to go a little bit deeper, and look at how underneath the climate crisis there is a crisis of human relationship, as you say, and June pointed to this as well, that there are deep and sort of centuries, if not millennia-old, sort of conditions which have led us up to this point. And so by going that deep, it's harder work than, say, education campaigns about recycling or something, which is what they call a shallow leverage point, easy to address, but actually limited benefit. If we go deeper into the human cultural and psychology and culture of it, this is what researchers call a deep leverage point. And so the relationship crisis that politicians, policymakers, people in more mainstream settings are starting to point towards can be understood probably best as a crisis of separation. And the solution to that is to reconnect in important ways. And that reconnection is sort of conscious reconnection. So we are disconnected from the harm that we're creating on the other side of the world. And Alyssa has mentioned how we actually might get more disconnected as things get worse. We're also disconnected from each other, importantly disconnected from nature, and interrelated with that, disconnected from ourselves. And this is where inner work, contemplative practices like mindfulness and compassion training can have something to contribute. Because, for instance, the extent to which we are connected to our bodies will have a bearing on how much empathy we have. Because actually we feel ourselves and how our bodies respond to other people when they're in distress. And so if we're disconnected from ourselves, we're disconnected from others and from the world that we inhabit. And like nature connection, for instance, is like one of the most important things to underpin sustainable behaviors and attitudes. Those who have a high connectedness to nature are twice as likely to display sustainable behaviors and have, and support serious climate action. So in my work with policymakers, and that's got pulled together in this report that I do have to plug, as well as your wonderful book, Susan, which is the Reconnection, Meeting the Climate Crisis Inside Out report, catalogues a lot of these mechanisms, and also pulls together perspectives of policymakers. And when we asked 25 or so politicians about how they see the inner dimension of the climate crisis. And they generally talked about how the mind is a victim of the climate crisis, as Alyssa said, how the mind is a barrier to action, that we have certain biases and stuff that stop us acting, how the mind is a driver of the climate crisis in the ways that I've just mentioned, this sort of disconnection and the acquisitiveness and that we have created institutionally now. And finally, that those who understand those three mechanisms point towards the feedback loops that you could describe as a breakdown loop in one way that Jingpa mentioned, or the possibility of like turning that on its head and creating a breakthrough loop. There are ways in which we can become more equal to the challenges of our times and transcend these problems. So we're very familiar with the language of or at least having seen this video, we're familiar with the external feedback loops. But we really need to start integrating inner and outer into our understanding of our collective predicament, because it's not just about an inner change. It's not just about outer changes. It's about balancing the two that are so interdependent.
Thank you, Jamie. So one of the human feedback loops is this idea of delusion, and the delusion that we don't really appreciate our interdependence. And so, Jimpa, I'd like to pass it over to you next to basically share with us, some Buddhist wisdom as it relates to interdependence, but just helping all of us, the non-Buddhists that are listening, appreciate like how brilliant it is to see that interdependence is a fact. There's there's not an argument about that, but help us to understand that it really is. And then what's the role of compassion? If we can understand our interdependence, what's the role of compassion, and how does that all fit with the climate crisis that we're facing?
Both Jamie and Elisa pointed out to something very fundamental about human beings, which is the way in which our mind, kind of instinctively, habitually responds to what we don't like, a crisis. When we feel distressed, we tend to try to protect ourselves by avoiding or not thinking about it, or being, feeling overwhelmed. And part of the challenge here is that until recently, until the climate science really evolved to a point where it begins to connect the dots, we did not have the conceptual tools to understand how our individual human behavior was contributing to degradation of the natural world. People did have a vague idea, but it was very difficult for ordinary people. I think the experts were beginning to uncover that, but for ordinary people, it's when it's a beautiful sunny day and the wind is blowing, there's no pollution in the air, then to say that climate is in crisis, it's very difficult for people to connect the dots. And so I think in the end, the key point Jamie raised about it's a crisis of connection is an important one, and part of that challenge is partly the limitations of the human mind, and also many of our kind of outlook on reality and the worldview, if I can use that term, that ordinary people have used, at least in the secular space, is kind of grounded in science. And science, until recently, has not really provided us a good model that ordinary people can understand about interconnectedness. Now, Buddhism, on the other hand, has interdependence and interconnectedness has been at the heart of the Buddha's teaching. In fact, one of the earliest, verses that is attributed to Buddha really is about interdependence. It's about causality, and how everything is interconnected, and there are causes and conditions, and some of the causes may be more direct and immediate, but many of the causes and conditions are quite far away. And then once a chain is set in motion, unless there is some mitigating circumstances, the effect is going to come into result is going to come into being. So, in the Buddhist tradition, for example, like the example of the imagery of the Indra's net, this is a net interconnected with jewels at each of the, kind of intersections. And in each of these jewels reflected all the other jewels, and there is no center and there is no periphery. So it's kind of this idea of, this whole entire world is a web of causality. They're all interconnected. When you make an impact in one area, the knock-on effect is going to be felt far away. So that there was one attempt to capture this concept of interconnectedness. And part of the challenge of interconnectedness is that we need, there are two dimensions, at least in the way in which Buddhist tradition understands. One is the temporal kind of interconnectedness, which is more linear. And here the challenge is to be able to, connect the causes that have gone quite far away with the effects that are going to come much later. So there's the temporal linear interconnectedness, interdependence. But the more difficult part is the horizontal, spatial interconnectedness, where things are happening simultaneously, which are actually have been impacted by what has happened in other networks. So this interconnectedness, interdependence has to be understood not just purely in causal terms of temporal process, but also spatial terms of simultaneous impacting of each other. And now, trying to conceptualize that by human mind is a tough one. So fortunately now climate science particularly, and some people have talked about systems thinking and all of systems dynamics, which is kind of beginning to get there. But climate science particularly has really captured this truth of interconnectedness, both temporally and spatially. And the climate feedback loops is a powerful illustration of that, one example of this. So I think it's, now that the climate science has really connected all the dots, I don't think there's any room for anybody to doubt. I mean, there used to be deniers before, but I don't think there is now any room for doubt at all. It's just so obvious, and the climate scientists have done the hard work of doing the work, and now, this is one area where science is in some ways more powerful than philosophy, because philosophy's tool is primarily thoughts and arguments and reasoning. Science gives you calculations and mathematics and models that could project and create models that would show us in some ways visual terms. And here I think the interconnectedness that science is showing and now needs to be brought not just at the physical level of this thing affecting that, but also the role of the human mind and our attitude. Because I remember many, many years ago, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when I started serving him in 1985, began to travel with him. But he began traveling in 1973, first to Europe and then 79 to the US. And when I first began translating for him, I studied many of the speeches that he has given. And one thing that struck me was that as early as late 70s, environmental awareness was an important theme in his talk. And he even presented a paper that came into a book called Buddhist Conception of Nature, Buddhist Perspective on Nature. And he brought home this concept of interdependence. But of course, His Holiness is a Buddhist philosopher, so his approach is primarily Buddhist philosophical approach. And, I wish at that time the climate science was evolved enough to be able to illustrate in visual terms what he was talking about. And one of the things that he had mentioned when I was beginning to travel with him, which I thought was very powerful, is that he said that one of the fundamental changes that need to be made is the very fundamental idea behind modern economy, which is based on perpetual growth. He said, if we don't tackle that, it will become unsustainable, because the perpetual growth presupposes consumption of nature, resources. And if we have to grow economy by a certain percentage every year, we're going to hit a dead end. So he said that something needs to be done where the people in the first world will have to find a way to adapt to a bit more modest, living standard. So, and he started talking about this, and particularly when the European, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, there was a prospect of a reunification of Germany and the Eastern European countries becoming more democratic. He even spoke with some policymakers at one of the retreats that he wished that there is this amazing opportunity where the dynamism of market forces coming from the capitalist system could be combined with a more ethically minded socialist kind of focus on equal distribution, and also taking into account a kind of this idea of a quality of life versus standard of living. So in those days, those were very early days, but I wish at that time we had the current scientific data that would really visually demonstrate the need to take into account this long-term causation. But anyway, it's gone. But now we are at a point where no one has an excuse to say we don't know. The causality, interdependence, interconnectedness has all been laid bare. And here I agree with Jamie that unless we tackle the fundamental root of crisis, which is the human mind and our kind of, our assumptions, and our habitual kind of, belief in, unless these are addressed, I think it's going to be quite tough just to rely on the policy, because policies in the end are at the governmental level or intergovernmental level. And, politicians have also other considerations. They answer not just to the human citizens of the world, but they also answer to the specific citizens who elect them, and then the parties that they have allegiance to. So I think relying just on policy changes alone is not really going to be, adequate. We need to also find ways to, fundamentally change the way in which humans think about ourselves, our relationship with nature. And here, I think the Buddhist voice is really going to be an important one, because this Buddhist emphasis on interdependence and interconnectedness, and also compassion, because compassion demands that we take responsibility to the knowledge of interconnectedness. Once we have the knowledge of interconnectedness, then what should be our basic attitude towards our fellow human beings, fellow species, and the planet that we inhabit? That basic attitude has to be grounded in compassion, empathy, that cares for not just ourselves but for others, and also that cares for, and here one key point is this, in Jamie's language it's connection, but I would say identification, some kind of identification with the nature, with others, with the world, has to be key. And there are now research that shows that, for example, people who tend to identify with their future selves, turns out they actually take more seriously savings. People who don't identify with their future selves are not interested in saving. So it has a real impact, consequence to our ability to identify. So I think one of the changes that we have to look for is the way in which we emotionally connect and identify with the natural world and all other human beings. So I think interdependence, compassion, and connection, these have to be fundamental parts of this new mindset that we are seeking, not just at the policy level, but at the ordinary person like us, our level as well.
Thank you, Chimpa. Yeah. So when we start expanding, going from ourselves and our small worlds and our comforts, and really appreciate how we are part of the web, that we are just, each of us are gems in this worldwide net of this web of interconnected jewels. And Alyssa, I'm curious from you as a behavioral, scientist, in terms of inspiring behavior change, and that a lot of behavior change theory, from my understanding, a lot of it comes back to individual incentives. But are there ways that we can really promote incentives to appreciate our interconnectedness and to really have compassion for one another, and to realize that we are enough and we have enough, and we need to have that mindset in order to show up in the ways that we need to? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Susan. The Age of Enough is a whole chapter in the book that reveals if we cannot have this transformation in our own view, there's no chance that we can transform our world away from this excessive ultra-capitalistic growth. I want to just echo the words of Jimpa. The interdependence, the compassion, and the connection are the values that we need for the behavior and social change that you're asking me about. So let's just start with, we've all been shaped to have a Western mindset that says that we are separate, that we're individuals, and that the law of the world is a linear causality that we can see and measure, that's right in front of us. And that is such a delusion of our perception and limitation of our mind. The reality is that we do live in a complex, interconnected system. And we have to borrow from models like quantum physics to understand that something that we do, something that happens in the world, can have these non-local effects on others. There is actually so much science behind that. So let's just start with Jinpa's idea of time. We have a sense that the separateness, the thinking in terms of our own life, we have a sense that we don't have an effect beyond our life and beyond our personhood. And so the vastness of the climate crisis leads us to feel helpless and hopeless, period. If we are just one, we really can't do much. And there can be this existential loss of meaning and this looking out for who someone else has to save us. It's not me, but it actually is me. It is each of us. And so in the Buddhist world of continuity, our words, our beliefs, our actions have continuity. They have effects. And in the Western world of science, we have shown that to the extent that we can. We know that we are influential in our emotions with emotion contagion, in our social modeling, and biologically in our neuroplasticity and in our epigenetics. We are lineages. We are passing on our future, both biologically, culturally, socially, emotionally. So the model for encapsulating all of this is really the social quantum change model, which is laid out so beautifully in your book, Susan, that was really brought together by Karen O'Brien. And in this model, we cannot see our influence, but bringing together the data and the theories, we cannot deny that we live in a complex system, and we have to actually feel and deeply believe that our actions matter as individuals. And as you said, Susan, I'm not just one, I'm 1 times 8 billion. The power of that. And maybe it's not 8 billion, maybe it's a percentage of 1 billion that's a social tipping point. And so that to me is part of our equanimity. It's part of our why we can feel that we can hold it all, not the dialectic of hopelessness and despair versus delusion, but that we have this chance, this unpredictable world, this beautiful chance at living a life of purpose toward the social tipping point. So when we think about the science of change, it's a bit reductionistic, but there are aspects that will relate to our conversation here. So for example, our sense of time is such that if we can help ourselves and change the narrative for others, that it is about it is here and now, that as Joanna Macy says, we need to go through this. There's no denying it. There's no looking for a different, statistics, but for the real, the narrative of hope. That hope, as Jane Goodall says, is a survival skill. And when we can actually think about that something is here and in front of us, and that we can touch it and act on it, that's empowering, that's motivating. And that is the model of local is global. This is how it's going to happen. We're not going to touch intergovernmental policy directly. We're going to touch those around us and have those ripple effects. and be models and transmit those models of change. So in terms of the time perspective, when we help people think about legacy, that motivates behavior. When we help them think about the communal efficacy, not just the can you do this action, but do you think that we can do this together? And so all of a sudden it becomes a narrative of communal empowerment. And so the interconnectedness, the compassion, the caring for others, the ability to see that our actions have continuity and are part of the social tipping point. We are moving social quantum change. And if we can remind ourselves of that really every day as we do our work, that is the way that, as you said, the individual links to the change in culture and policy. And that's the reality. I think there's I'm just going to point to your book as the reference because you bring it all together with the citations. I do want to say that when we think about, we want to touch policy and we know we need to change our hearts and our minds for sustainable change, the impact between our beliefs and attitudes and policy, there is a two-way street. There is a bi-directional arrow. So we do need to change public will, personal will for political will. But when we can have a local win, when we can have a change in policy, it changes hearts and minds. So, for example, no one believed that we should be forced to wear seatbelts. There was a personal individual freedom belief. When the law was enacted, the attitude changed, the norms changed from 11% of people saying, yes, we should all wear them, to 90% of people from this one law change. And so we need both. We need the top-down small wins in policy to show that we can do this. And that will change our mind, as well as this culture change that we're all working on, that we can touch as individuals.
Hear, hear, Alyssa. Thank you. So we're going to wrap up with Jamie actually perfectly building on what Alyssa just shared. So there are a couple parts I'd love you to touch on, Jamie. And a lot of your work, both on a small scale, but also on a national scale, does relate to mindfulness and inner development. And would love to, hear your thoughts of where mindfulness can come, and mindfulness and compassion, really both. Like it's not one or the other, but the two. And to buoy us to basically not only see the dark side of what's happening, but maybe some of the beauty and the love that's before us as well. And then maybe your final comments can build on what Alyssa said, which is how can we, in a real practical way, go from being individuals to actually impacting policy, and even considering policy going beyond national policy or continental policy, but intercontinental policy, because that's what we're going to be really need, is for us to be truly working together as one global human family, as His Holiness says. So over to you, Jamie.
Wow. Okay, a simple one then. So if we look at mindfulness and compassion training, first of all, which are interesting as a kind of secular form of some of the ancient wisdom and practices that have been passed down through the Buddhist tradition, and because they now have over 20,000 academic articles to support them in that secular context. And so there's neuroscience and lots of implementation now in various fields, from policing to workplaces, including in politics, which is the environment that I'm most connected to. And there are forms of inner development which really focus on the intentional cultivation of capacities of heart and mind, both mindfulness and compassion actually are kind of umbrella terms, and there are lots of sort of different capacities within that. But essentially, we are training the mind, for instance, to be more attentive, more aware, to have better attentional faculties. And when it comes to, I mean, in my reconnection report, we look at how each of these are fundamental throughout human history and have underpinned our success as a species until this point, and why they're particularly key just now. So, for instance, attention renders our world for us, binds all these other faculties together that we have. But it's this faculty is currently being undermined in a pretty systematic way by social media and what is called the attention economy. And this is sort of supercharged. This desire to distract ourselves is kind of enabled and supercharged by, the digital world that we inhabit. And that's just one example of where mindfulness is starting to become aware of where your mind is at any given point, and to more consciously decide what to attend to is fundamental as we're collectively wanting to attend to something very important. Compassion and emotional intelligence, hugely important, faculty for us to really feel the movement towards wanting to help, wanting to be part of the change. As examples, you mentioned, so that they're kind of more fundamental aspects, and then we have this particular crisis, and it's already been mentioned how mindfulness in Alyssa's first sharing really helps us to turn towards the difficult. Why is it that we're sort of more resilient and able to stay engaged? And in our research, we hear this phrase again and again, which is like, how do we stay with the trouble? How do we turn towards it initially? How do we care, develop those capacities, engage and stay engaged? How do we stay with that trouble? And it's about regulating difficult emotions, the anger, the grief, the actually quite understandable and maybe adaptive in some circumstances, difficult feelings. And also, how do we cultivate the positive? Because we really need both. And if we're going to stay engaged, we need to feel being moved by feelings of deep love, not just by anger. Feeling the joy of actually, I'm getting something from engaging in my local climate movement or whatever. Actually, I'm getting the social connection and the feeling of doing something and focusing on that joy, the sense of awe in nature, the sense of gratitude and appreciation. These are what some scientists call self-transcending emotions. Or as one researcher, one sort of expert I work with, Dan Siegel, talks about them as self-expanding emotions. And this goes to what Jingpa was saying about our identity actually needing to broaden. And these emotions help that process, where this circle of compassion, this circle of identity gets bigger and bigger over time as you practice some of these capacities and practice different ways of seeing. And this goes potentially to the crux of my work, of your work, of the reconnection narrative, which is expanding our identity, but also developing a holistic worldview. And I mentioned the deep leverage point for change earlier. That is the nub of it, the mindset, which is not so much this sort of individualized mindset, but one that sees the world of deep interconnectivity. And being that is part of what we can do. So to move to like, what can we do as individuals? I'm actually involved in another climate movement called the Climate Majority Project that's just launching this week in 3 days' time in the UK. And the idea is that radical movements have come and disrupted the scene in the UK and Europe particularly, but a little bit in the US. Extinction Rebellion, another program called Just Stop Oil. They're doing direct action and that kind of radical activity really actually shifted the narrative in some places. There's actually much higher awareness than there has ever been, and an appetite for change. Extreme weather as well as Extinction Rebellion have made that happen. But most people don't have a kind of activist even, or certainly not a radical or a law-breaking identity, and couldn't get involved in that. Wouldn't culturally be appropriate for them. But they want to do something. And actually they struggle to think about the hugeness of transnational policy making, etc. And this goes back into the kind of quantum social change paradigm, is that actually we need 1,000 movements that come together on, I mean, this needs to be, and will inevitably be, as things get, worse, the biggest social movement in history. We just need to accelerate it so it happens sooner rather than later, before it's really too late. And this means getting involved in your profession. There's lawyers for net zero, or parents for the future, or Friday, or it's the bake sale on your local street, etc. Don't underestimate the individual conversations that you can have, and don't underestimate finding your social tribe, particularly if it's outside of the kind of progressive activist milieu, which where most of the climate movement has been and been speaking in the language of. Now what we're starting to see is right-wing movements, at least in the UK, saying we can't just leave this to the lefties. We want to say this in our own language, in our own way. And the Climate Majority Project has these 4 pillars, one of which is inner work, because it recognizes that all of us are on a journey of shifting mindsets, and all of us need support staying with the trouble once we've engaged. And actually, a lot of people who are running these kind of bake sales, or like I say, Lawyers for Net Zero, or many of these other initiatives, become kind of de facto emotional support people as leaders in these initiatives. So it's really bound up together. So reinforce, practice particularly gratitude, but go into nature, open up to the awe that's all around you, be resourced and enlarged by those activities. And don't underestimate those little bits of change, which together, it's difficult to see it in the round, but are inevitably going to be the biggest social movement we've ever seen.
Thank you, Jamie. It's a perfect way for us to end this incredible panel. We are not alone. I think that was one of the things that I found in writing the book, and the more conversations I have with people, it was scary to talk about this. It was overwhelming and felt really, really isolated. And the more that we can come out and connect with one another, to listen to one another, to share, and realize we're not alone, we can actually find that there's strength in not only how it makes us feel, but in what we can do together. So deep gratitude, Jamie, Bristow, Alyssa Epple, Thupten Jinpa. Gratitude to the Mind and Life Institute, and also to the Climate Emergency Feedback Loops films that are sponsoring this program, and to We Don't Have Time. We started this conversation because we were inspired by a conversation, and my sincere hope is that you continue the conversation in your own communities, and to just show up and look at what we can do together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.